My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Diplomatic Immunity. I'm Kelly McFarland, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Ambassador Robert Blackwill. Ambassador Blackwill is a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and before that, he served for a very long time at high-level positions here in Washington and around the world. He was a Foreign Service officer before serving on the National Security Council, and he was also the U.S. Ambassador to India in the early 2000s. Today, Robert's joining us to talk about a new report he just authored for the Council on Foreign Relations called America Revived, a Grand Strategy of Resolute Global Leadership. Ambassador, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So I will say before we started the recording, Robert and I got into a long dissertation on Notre Dame football, which we will not bore the rest of you with, and we'll get into some grand strategy here instead. So I'm going to start off, Ambassador, with sort of giving people a little broad overview of the different schools that you talk about. So you categorize American grand strategy in your paper into 5 distinct sort of historical schools. That's the primacy school, liberal internationalism, restraint, American nationalism, and Trumpism. So before we get into your school, can you provide listeners with a little bit of information on how you define those?
Good. Let me do it chronologically, which is different from how you did it and how the report does it. But I didn't define it. The reader will see that there are almost 300 footnotes, and the description of the report, in the report of these schools, is from their primary documents and what they've said, not my opinion. So let me start at the beginning properly, which is 1776. For well over a century, U.S. grand strategy was American nationalism. There was a period before the First World War with McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt where they were active abroad, but mostly during that period of well over a century, the United States had 2 premises with respect to its grand strategy. One was stick to the Western Hemisphere, and the second was trade around the world, including with Asia, and use tariffs to boost trade. So that was the original American grand strategy. And as we'll see, and I think the viewers know, the readers will see the report, we return to it later on. After World War II, there was a revolution in American grand strategy. And for the first time in American history, Americans decided that the admonition from the founders about don't get into entangling alliances and all the rest was no longer appropriate to a world in which the Soviet Union was seeking first to dominate Europe and then beyond. So the first time in our history, our grand strategy emphasized cooperation with allies and with partners to increase deterrence and avoid war. And that was basically liberal internationalism up through the first Trump administration. It was practiced differently by various presidents, but most of that period was liberal internationalist, now called the rule of law or some such version, code of conduct. But it was based on, as I say, deterrence and American values and those of our allies. There was a brief period of primacy, that is to say, America having hegemonic power in every region, in every dimension. And that is discussed widely, but not always identified as about 15 years in length, the so-called unipolar moment after the fall of the Soviet Union and before the rise of China. So primacy was a very brief, nearly footnote in our history. Next, I go to restraint. Restraint, the basic idea of restraint is that almost every war since the end of the Second World War that America's fought in has been a mistake. We should reduce our commitments. We should reduce our presence, and try to affect the balance of power by coming in when there was a problem, but not by permanent presence in any of the pertinent regions. It has never been adopted by an American administration. So restraint in its purest form appears on the pages of foreign affairs and in podcasts and in academia, but never as U.S. policy. And that brings us to Trumpism. Trumpism has some characteristics of American nationalism, the emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, on borders, and on tariffs. But it's also very different from American nationalism because President Trump takes America all over the globe. And that's an anathema to the American nationalists. So they don't believe, at least in their pure form, of course, they succumb to President Trump's pressure, but American nationalists would not have America negotiating a Gaza ceasefire or a Ukrainian ceasefire, or for that matter, peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan and 5 or 6 or 8 others. Trumpism then, I think, is unique in American history. We've never seen anything like this combination that I just described. And to finish, that, in my view, means that Trumpism will not survive the end of Donald Trump's second term because it is so unique. And I think as we go forward, the two alternatives that will face policymakers with the next president and far beyond are a version of primacy and liberal internationalism, or a weak version of liberal internationalism, and American nationalism. Do we go out into the world, and if so, how much? And so those are the schools, and I propose, as you indicated, a fusion of American of liberal internationalism and primacy.
Right. So let's move into that. You do propose a sixth school, which you call Resolute Global Leadership. So how does that bridge that gap between these primacy schools and liberal internationalism?
Well, first, Resolute Global Leadership. Each of those words carefully chosen, of course. Resolute is a reference that is described at length in the report. My view that liberal internationalism became weaker and weaker in its expression in the last 15 years. And I have a list of the weaknesses and the many policy mistakes of administrations in the last 15 years. I'm not counting President Trump and Trumpism. And I think, therefore, liberal internationalism has become a faint replica of what it was under Harry Truman or Jack Kennedy or even Bill Clinton. So resolute means not weak liberal internationalism, but strong, much stronger liberal internationalism. Global means what it says. You can't concentrate on only the Western Hemisphere, and you reject spheres of influence, which President Trump seems attracted to. And then leadership, also self-explanatory, that America will go on acting, or should act, as if it's the most powerful nation on earth, which it is. But many seem not to recognize that. So it's a fusion between the military capabilities of the primacist and the emphasis on international institutions and alliances of the liberal internationalists. And I think that combination is the best one suited for the period ahead, because I think the period ahead now and ahead is arguably the most dangerous in American history, and certainly since the end of World War II, because of the rise of China.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. Coupled with technological advancements and where that's going to take us, we are living in a dangerous world at the moment. But so I want to interrogate this a little bit by kind of talking about it in contrast to some of these other schools a little bit more. So you mentioned the primacy school, which is the hegemonic United States. That was to think unipolar moment kind of stuff. That seeks to prevent the reemergence of any sort of peer competitor. Your strategy, though, accepts that China has emerged as a peer competitor. And so in a world where there is no longer this unipolar moment, and primacy isn't the school the avenue we're going down. What does a sort of theory of victory look like when the goal is to balance power rather than to maintain sort of to follow the lines of the primacy school?
Well, victory is not the objective of my particular grand strategy, because I think victory against China is very hard to define unless you believe China is going to follow the Soviet Union and dissolve itself, which I do not believe. So it's not a matter of victory. It is, as you said, a matter of balancing. And it is to have a sufficient deterrent to prevent China from undermining our vital national interests. That is the balance. And let's imagine that one of our vital national interests, which I believe it is to avoid a hegemonic power in Eurasia, especially in the rimlands. And we have been losing ground militarily to China in the last 15 to 20 years, year by year, because of inadequate defense spending and inadequate defense reform. And therefore, we need to increase the defense budget and also reform our procurement process, because we want military superiority over China. And that, of course, has a big technological component as well. Diplomatically, we've been losing ground to China because of our failures in a variety of ways. I'll just mention the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We authored it. It was born in Washington, and then the Obama administration walked away from it. The most important multilateral trade agreement in American history, and they walked away from it. And now, ironically enough, we're not a member of it, and China is petitioning to become a member of it. So diplomatically, and economically and trade, we've ceded so much of the field to China, and we have to reverse that. But one last point, I don't want to sound pessimistic. I developed in the second half of the report what I think are the weaknesses of Trumpism. I try in the first half to, as objectively as I can, drawing on what he said and his principal supporters have said, to give a fair reading of it. I just don't agree with much of it. But at least so far, these are policies that can be reversed, that he's adopted. And so I believe liberal internationalism, the fusion with primacy that I advance, it's not dead. Liberal internationalism isn't dead, despite what one heard at Davos and Munich. It's not dead. It can be revived.
I'm going to follow up on that quickly, because this is one of the things that always intrigues me when we see people advocating for their certain school. And when you talk about military superiority and trying to maintain military superiority, especially over a peer competitor like China, that always brings in the questions of means versus ends. And so when you talked about procurement and defense spending and things like that, how do you square that circle of not having increasingly massive and more massive defense budgets, but while still trying to maintain that superiority? Is it in being smarter about what we buy, or moving away from these, legacy platforms that we don't need anymore necessarily, but for political reasons, a lot of them are still being produced? Or, how do you sort of deal with that angle of this?
Well, you did both of the components. One is that to modernize the force through reform and ingenuity with the newest technologies. But equally, we have to increase the number. The budget submitted by President Trump at the beginning of second term was in real terms less than the final budget of President Biden in real terms. And therefore, and that's been consistent for the last 15 years. And there's a curiosity that as we've become much more strident in our criticism of China, except for this president, but at the same time, we have watched the military gap between the United States and China close dramatically. We still have superiority globally, but in the first island chain, including Taiwan, there's a real question of how a war would turn out, which means deterrence is weakened. So we need to spend more money on defense. And that may require higher taxes, but in any case, we do. And I know that President Trump, in a rather offhand way, said that he thought his next budget should be $1.5 trillion, which would be a 1/3 increase in the defense budget. Count me skeptical.
So you also make a good point in the report about the importance of thinking of like second and third order issues from selecting a certain school of strategy to go down. And you talk about these schools that are becoming more and more discussed in policy circles, this restraint and Trumpism, that they're dangerous to test because they assume that U.S. withdrawal would enhance domestic security and American prosperity. But, the world doesn't stop moving when we do that. And we risk a world where we create security vacuums. And, as a former diplomat and somebody who does this sort of stuff, what do you see as potential hotspots or issues that could be created during these security vacuums if we were really to test restraint and Trumpism to a full extent?
Well, one would begin, of course, in the Indo-Pacific and China, because it seeks to weaken our alliances there. It seeks to increase its coercive power over its neighbors. It is every day in the midst of stealing intellectual property from the West and all the rest. And so were we to withdraw, that would simply, almost by definition, do two things. It would increase their capacity to get their way geopolitically in the region and beyond, because other people outside that region would be observing, and it would weaken deterrence on Taiwan. The most dangerous of the many dangers that face the global system today is a war between the United States and China over Taiwan. And deterrence is weakening, I believe, because of the weakness of liberal internationalism, and now because of the uncertainty of President Trump. Because deterrence, of course, depends on both capability, but also on trust. And if we were to leave a vacuum in the Indo-Pacific, an entire vacuum, or dramatically reduce our presence, then if you were the Prime Minister of Japan and you watched America withdraw forces from Japan, seem weak on whether, as the treaty between the United States and Japan indicates, not come to Japan's side if it was attacked by China, what would you do? Well, you'd certainly at least consider acquiring nuclear weapons. And the debate today in Japan and in South Korea is the strongest in either country's history about whether they should acquire nuclear weapons. And this is because of the trust issue. Would President Trump, in this case, actually come to their aid? So that vacuum would certainly encourage our friends in Asia to consider acquiring nuclear weapons, in addition to what I said before, which is to leave the field to China to, and as I said before, to control the Asian rimlands all the way past the first island chain, and then support Russia in its effort to undermine the alliance on the other side of Eurasia. So to test the proposition that somehow balancing with reduced forces and reduced trust would have a happy ending, I'm highly doubtful of that.
Right. It's a dangerous proposition to test. And, and part of this strength of the U.S. is the strength that we gain from our allies. And a lot of recent political discourse, over the past decade has been this issue of what we get from our allies and free riding, and we're paying for everything, and what, they owe us so much money and all that kind of stuff. But there is a fine line to walk between getting them to spend more on defense, which they need to do, and which the war in Ukraine has put in stark contrast to the fact that Europeans need to spend more on defense. But there's also, you risk going too far that they then try to seek strategic autonomy and military autonomy on their own outside of sort of a NATO framework or a hub and spoke framework in Asia. So, how do you walk that line in your Resolute Global Leadership?
Well, we should, and I wrote a book with Richard Fontaine about this a year and a half ago. We should pivot to Asia for sure, because China represents the existential threat to the United States for the next decade, 2, 3. At the same time, we need to leave forces in Europe. And more important, we need to reaffirm our commitment to European security and to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which commits us to the defense of Europe. And President Trump has called that into question in a variety of ways. And the same thing is true in the Middle East, although that is the most stable region now among the three primary regions, Middle East, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific, not because of America, but because of Israel and the Israeli Defense Forces, which now are militarily hegemonic in the Middle East. But in the Middle East, we too should draw down, but again, not reduce our commitment to peace and stability in the Middle East. So we would draw down our forces in both those regions and to a considerable degree, but not call into question our commitment. in this case, first to Israel, and then to our other friends in the Middle East, and to our friends and allies in Europe. And I think that's manageable, but it's hard to know with President Trump what will happen in the next 3 years. My report went to the publisher at the end of December, and that was, for example, before the Greenland affair emerged. Right. And so when I argue that his policies can be reversed once he's out of office, then that ignores the fact that he has 3 more years. And my advice to all of us is to watch what he does, not what he says. I think living our lives by watching for his 2 a.m. tweets is not a good way to think of U.S. grand strategy. It is rather, what does he actually do? And for example, does he, at the forthcoming summit in China with President Xi Jinping, agree to China's definition of the one China policy, that is, that Taiwan should be part of the mainland? That would be an action that would matter not in a tweet, but in a concrete action. And we know from the press and Chinese sources that's what President Xi is going to try to persuade him to do. And one could go on. If one travels, and you probably do too, to Eastern Europe, notion that President Trump would devote America's military resources to defend Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania is highly questioned across Europe. And that's because of what he said. So I think that the Europeans were, of course, all a Twitter over Greenland, not because of an action he took, not even because of an action that he said he was going to take, that is, say, using military force to acquire Greenland, but rather an action that he would consider taking. All of that because of not an action, but of a tweet or a series of statements. So I, of course, worry about what he'll do the next 3 years. But these alliances of the United States are stronger than many people believe. They've weathered hurricanes before, with Charles de Gaulle kicking NATO out of Paris in 1963. You're the historian. You know all the Vietnam War, the Second Iraq War, and so forth and so forth. We've come through many before. And I believe with the right policy following President Trump, and especially because I don't think Trumpism survives President Trump, that we shouldn't be so negative about future. Let me just say one other thing in this context. There's now a flood of articles about multipolar worlds. I believe that that's a fantasy. I think we're headed for a bipolar world, the United States and China. It will be very familiar to us in many ways. Countries will try to maneuver between the two. Alliance management on our part will be important, as it always was in the last bipolar period. And many of those comments about the multipolar world are based on, I think, an erroneous judgment about American power. There's a book recently published about American power and world order called First Among Equals. The United States is not first among equals. It's first. It has the most compelling military power. It has the largest economy, and it has the greatest diplomatic reach. So those who counsel multipolar propositions ignore the fact that we are the most powerful country on earth. Politically, diplomatically, it's the United States that's negotiating all these problems around the world. Militarily, no one can touch us, although China closes the gap, and we have the largest economy in the world. So we can be confident if we use this power wisely, and we don't need to enter the period ahead in self-denigration and melancholy. But it does take a sensible policy, and I respect some of the things that President Trump has accomplished, including the Gaza ceasefire and hostage return and the 5% commitment on the part of the NATO allies. We'll see if they do it, but the commitment was important. The attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran, which I strongly support. But I worry as we go forward how much more he will erode, especially the trust, and what actions he will take that are irrevocable.
Yeah,
I don't believe any so far are irrevocable, and I hope he doesn't take any that turn out to be that.
Yeah, I think your points underline the importance of what our underlying assumptions are when deciding on policy and grand strategy, and this view of American strength versus Chinese strength. Obviously, if you have differing views on that, your then policies coming out of that, emanating from those underlying assumptions, are different and can change. And I think we can have a whole nother podcast episode on the different arguments out there on where the US and China are in relation to each other and where they will be, and peak China versus have we already seen it, and all these different arguments. But I'm going to get you out of here on this on last question. And I know we've talked about the fact that, as hard as it may seem to believe, after the last 13 months, we still do have 3 more years of a Trump administration. And but let's take as our underlying assumption that he doesn't do anything that, to your point, is irrevocable, right? That we still are in a world in 3 years where things can be changed and put back. What do you think would be your sort of top 1 or 2 recommendations on how to move forward with your strategy, that are sort of top of the list things to knock off?
So what has to be reversed? Well, first of all, the questions he leaves in our allies' minds about whether we consider our alliances as commitments that will last and are robust and believable. And he's been eroding that through his words. And so the next American president, I hope, will reaffirm the importance of allies in our grand strategy. Or put it differently, President Trump apparently believes that America can be best protected by acting alone, without allies and friends as trustworthy supporters and engagers with us. And that has to be reversed. The second is values. President Trump is the first American president who says explicitly that he has no framework of values on which he acts. He acts on the basis only of what he thinks is best. Stephen Miller put it more directly in expressing, let's not kid ourselves, all that matters is power. I think that's un-American. No American president has ever said all that matters is power. We have values. We have American values. And I don't imagine most of the viewers don't want to live in a world governed by the jungle. When I was in the Serengeti, I had my guide say, Every night in the Serengeti, some animals eat and some animals are eaten. That's Stephen Miller's world. That's not the world that I want to live in, or my children. I want my children, my grandchildren to live in. So that's number two, is America represents values in the world. We always have. And I think once President Trump is out of office, we will again. So those are my big two, both overarching. America is safer in the world with its alliance partners, and it's more credible in the world in its expression of our values.
Yeah, well, I agree wholeheartedly on those. So let's hope that those are still two pathways that we are available to go down in 3 years. But Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. And I really hope folks go out and take a deeper read into your new report.
Thank you very much. It's on CFR.org. And thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. And we'll put it in the show notes too, so people will be able to find it. Thank you.
Thank you.